Are you ready to embark on a journey of overcoming and hope? Discover the inspiring story of Natalie, a young woman who faced years of anxiety and panic attacks. Follow each step of her transformation, from the darkest moments to the small victories that changed her life. Overcoming anxiety is an emotional account that shows it's possible to rediscover the strength within yourself. Don't miss this video that can touch your heart and perhaps even change your perspective on life. Watch now and be inspired by Natalie's incredible journey toward freedom and self-discovery. Natalie Walker sat in the driver's seat of her car, but it felt as though the vehicle was swallowing her whole. Her breathing was rapid, her fingers trembled on the steering wheel, and the deafening sound of her own heartbeat was all she could hear. The air around her seemed heavy, almost unbreathable, as beads of sweat rolled down her forehead, despite the mild morning weather. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, trying to ignore the crushing feeling that engulfed her. This is it. This is how it ends, she thought for the third time that month. The harsh reality was familiar, another panic attack. Natalie had parked in front of the grocery store 10 minutes earlier but hadn't been able to step out of the car. The simple thought of walking across the parking lot and facing the bustling store felt impossible. Her hands desperately searched for her phone on the console. She needed to call someone, anyone. But who? Names flashed through her mind like torn pages from a book until she finally caved and dialed her mother. The moment she heard her mother's comforting voice on the other end, the tears began to flow, unstoppable and heavy with shame. "I can't do it, Mum. Everything's wrong. I'm stuck," she said, trying to explain the inexplicable. Her mother tried to console her, but the words seemed distant, as though they came from a world beyond the confines of her car. Natalie felt like an island, surrounded by an ocean of her fears. After some time, she ended the call, leaned back in her seat, and tried to take deep breaths. It was a trick she had read about in an article on anxiety, but in that moment, it seemed useless. Her thoughts raced. "I'm weak. Why doesn't anyone else feel like this? Why does this only happen to me?" At that moment, Natalie didn't know that these thoughts weren't true. To her, they were everything. Eventually, the panic began to subside. Her breathing slowed, the sweat dried, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. Natalie drove back home in silence, without buying what she needed. As soon as she stepped into her small apartment, the safety of the four walls seemed to embrace her. She let her bag drop to the floor, leaned against the door, and closed her eyes. The scene was a perfect metaphor for her life, closed off, limited, unable to see a way out. "I can't keep living like this," she whispered to herself. That phrase echoed, almost like an unconscious decision to seek something different, something she couldn't yet define. As night fell, Natalie stared at the ceiling as she often did. But this time, something felt different. It wasn't relief, but a weariness that begged for change. Somehow, she sensed that day might mark the beginning of something greater. Before anxiety took over her life, Natalie Walker was known for her determination and creativity. At 26 years old, she worked as a marketing analyst for a promising company, thriving on every opportunity to turn ideas into memorable campaigns. Her vibrant personality made her a favorite among her colleagues, who often invited her to happy hours and team events. Natalie radiated energy, always smiling and willing to help. She wasn't just good at her job, she excelled. Weekends were filled with brunches with friends at cozy cafes or long walks in nearby parks, where she often shared her dreams of starting her own marketing agency. Natalie had a plan, and the word impossible was never part of her vocabulary. When she talked about her goals, her eyes sparkled with excitement, and no one doubted her ability to achieve them. However, like a silent storm, the first signs of anxiety began to creep in. At first, they were subtle: sweaty palms before a presentation, sleepless nights before major deadlines, or the inability to switch off her mind at the end of the day. Natalie, always a perfectionist, chalked these moments up to her drive for excellence. "If I'm not worrying, then maybe I'm not trying hard enough," she often thought. The pace at work became more demanding, and the expectations grew. Natalie took on each new challenge as a test of her skills, convincing herself that she had to exceed everyone's expectations. But the sacrifices began to pile up. First, she started canceling plans with friends, claiming she was too busy. Then, her cherished weekend walks were replaced by long hours in front of her computer, even on Sundays. Slowly, her social life began to crumble, but Natalie didn't notice she was losing her balance. Restless nights turned into full-blown insomnia, and her productivity started to falter. Rather than seeing this as a warning sign, she pushed herself harder. "I just need to work more, manage my time better," she told herself, refusing to acknowledge that something was wrong. The first episodes of heart palpitations arrived during team meetings, but Natalie dismissed them as temporary stress. It wasn't until a coworker mentioned she looked exhausted that she began to worry. At home, things weren't much better. Natalie's mother, always attentive, tried to talk to her several times, but Natalie brushed off any concerns with a forced smile. "I'm fine, just a little busy." However, her facade began to crack. Small tasks, like paying bills or tidying up her apartment, started to feel insurmountable. The weight of external and internal expectations grew heavier each day. The turning point came one evening as Natalie tried to prepare for a critical presentation. Sitting at her dining table, surrounded by papers and with her laptop open, she felt her heart racing out of control. The sensation hit her like a wave, leaving her dizzy and breathless. The presentation was forgotten as she rushed to the bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, terrified. That was her first panic attack. Even then, Natalie tried to dismiss what had happened, blaming it on lack of sleep and work stress. But the attacks didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more intense, and began to dictate her behavior. The confident, driven Natalie who once thrived under pressure was now avoiding key meetings and requesting longer deadlines. Her productivity plummeted, but the shame of admitting she needed help pushed her deeper into isolation. It wasn't long before the cycle was complete. The spark that once defined her had faded, and Natalie, once so vibrant and full of life, had become a prisoner of a fear she didn't yet understand. Hitting rock bottom came abruptly for Natalie, like a roar she could no longer ignore. After months of increasingly frequent panic attacks, she found herself on the brink of collapse. Work, which had once been her source of pride, had become a prison. The mere thought of facing a room full of colleagues was unbearable, and the pressure to deliver results consumed her completely. The breaking point arrived on a Monday morning. Natalie was at the office, preparing for a presentation she was supposed to lead in front of the company's directors. Her heart had been racing since the night before, when she tried to memorize her slides amid incessant thoughts of failure. As her coworkers arrived, laughing and exchanging jokes, Natalie felt the room closing in around her. The air seemed thin. When her manager called her to start, her voice failed, and her breathing became erratic. "Sorry, I need a minute," she stammered before rushing out. The room fell silent. Out in the hallway, her body trembled uncontrollably. She locked herself in the bathroom, sat on the cold floor, and tried to breathe. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of failure crushed her. "I'll never be able to do this again," she thought repeatedly. After long minutes, Natalie managed to pull herself together enough to return to the office. But that day, she made a decision that would change everything. She resigned on the spot. Amid apologies and excuses to her manager, she claimed she was overwhelmed and needed time for herself. Her manager, surprised, reluctantly accepted her decision but advised her to seek help, something Natalie immediately dismissed, unwilling to admit the depth of her struggles. With her job now behind her, Natalie expected relief to follow. Instead, she found an even greater void. Without the structure of work to distract her, anxiety filled every corner of her life. Simple tasks, like grocery shopping or answering a phone call, became impossible battles. Isolation became her new reality. One afternoon, as she struggled to motivate herself to leave the house, Natalie received a text from her friend Olivia, someone she hadn't spoken to in months. "Are you okay? You've disappeared," the message read. Natalie stared at the words on the screen but didn't reply. She felt incapable of explaining what she was going through. After all, how could she describe something she barely understood herself? Things reached their breaking point when Natalie attempted to go grocery shopping. Upon parking at the store, she found herself paralyzed once again. It was as if the car was the only thing shielding her from the chaos of the outside world. She sat there for nearly an hour before giving up, driving back home with trembling hands on the wheel. It became clear to her then that she couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. That night, as she stared at her bedroom ceiling, the same phrase echoed in her mind: "I'm broken." It was the first time she fully acknowledged the depth of her pain. Yet, alongside that acknowledgement came a small, almost imperceptible spark of hope. For the first time, Natalie began to wonder if there was a way out of the darkness. Perhaps there was something, or someone, that could help her make sense of what was happening. The next day, still hesitant, Natalie picked up her phone and searched therapy for anxiety online. After a few minutes, she found the website of a local clinic and scheduled an appointment. It was a small step, but one that felt monumental in that moment. As she hung up the phone, a mix of fear and relief washed over her. Could this really help? She wondered. And so, Natalie took her first step towards something different. She didn't yet know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she had taken a leap of faith in the possibility of change. The waiting room at the therapy clinic was surprisingly welcoming. Pastel-colored walls, elegant potted plants, and a soft soundtrack filled the space. For Natalie, however, the atmosphere wasn't enough to calm the storm raging inside her. Sitting on a leather chair with her hands clasped and fingers fidgeting, she wondered if coming here had been a mistake. What if they don't understand? What if I can't explain myself? Her thoughts raced faster than she could control. "Ms. Walker?" the receptionist called. Natalie hesitated before standing, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. When she entered Dr. Michael Harlow's office, she saw a man in his 50s with thin-framed glasses and a kind smile. He greeted her with a handshake that was firm but friendly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Natalie. Why don't you take a seat and tell me what brought you here?" For a moment, the words got caught in her throat. But with a deep breath, Natalie began to describe her life over the past few months. She talked about work, the panic attacks, and how her routine had shrunk to almost nothing. As she spoke, tears welled up, but Dr. Harlow let her continue without interrupting. When she finally finished, he handed her a tissue and said calmly, "Natalie, you're not alone in this. What you're experiencing is more common than you might think, and there are ways to manage it." Their first session focused on understanding. Dr. Harlow explained how anxiety worked in the brain, describing it as a survival response that, in cases like Natalie's, had gone off course. He suggested starting with simple techniques like deep breathing exercises and mindfulness practice. To Natalie, it all sounded abstract and distant. She listened politely but doubted that such basic approaches could help with the storm she faced. Over the next few weeks, Natalie began trying the techniques he had recommended. At first, everything felt artificial and ineffective. Controlled breathing seemed impossible during moments of panic, and sitting silently for mindfulness only made her mind scream louder. Yet, she committed to continuing, driven by the faint thread of hope she still held onto. One particularly tough morning brought Natalie her first small victory. She had woken up feeling the familiar grip of panic creeping into her chest. Instead of succumbing, she sat on her bedroom floor, closed her eyes, and began counting her breaths, as Dr. Harlow had taught her. "3," she whispered, forcing herself to focus on the rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but the panic began to subside. When she finally opened her eyes, she realized she had managed to avoid a full-blown attack. It was a brief moment, but one filled with meaning. Maybe this can work, she thought. However, progress wasn't linear. Some days, Natalie felt worse than before and questioned whether her efforts were worth it. During one of these discouraging sessions, Dr. Harlow introduced a concept that changed her perspective: acceptance. He explained that fighting anxiety often amplified it. "Anxiety isn't your enemy," he said. "It's a part of you. The key isn't to eliminate it but to learn how to live with it." Those words struck a chord with Natalie in an unexpected way. For the first time, she began to view her anxiety not as a monster to be defeated but as something that needed understanding. That shift in perspective brought a lightness she hadn't felt in months. Another turning point came when Natalie challenged herself to do something she had been avoiding for weeks, entering a busy cafe. The idea terrified her, but with Dr. Harlow's guidance, she prepared meticulously. That day, she dressed carefully, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. As she entered the cafe, the familiar tightness in her chest reappeared, but she pressed on. She ordered a coffee, found a seat, and stayed there for 10 minutes. Though she felt tense the entire time, she accomplished her goal. As she walked out, she felt both exhausted and proud. "I did it," she thought. These small steps began to build into something greater. Natalie still had a long road ahead, but she was learning that recovery wasn't a singular event, it was a series of choices made every day. For the first time in a long while, she began to believe that real change was possible. Natalie couldn't help but smile as she looked at her cup of coffee. She was sitting in a cafe she used to frequent before anxiety had turned her life into a battlefield. Though she still felt a slight tension in her shoulders and a faint tightness in her chest, simply being there, sitting alone, was an accomplishment she didn't take lightly. It reminded her that small steps were, in reality, significant victories. The days following her first challenge at the cafe were marked by a mix of progress and setbacks. Some mornings still began with the familiar wave of fear creeping into her mind, but now Natalie had tools to face it. Controlled breathing, which once seemed like a useless exercise, had become an anchor. And while mindfulness wasn't something she had fully mastered, moments of focus on the present brought her a kind of relief she had never known before. During this time, Olivia, a longtime friend, re-entered Natalie's life. The two hadn't spoken in months, ever since Natalie had started to isolate herself. Olivia was one of those people whose presence seemed to light up any room, with a contagious smile and a warm energy. When Natalie finally responded to one of Olivia's persistent messages, her friend wasted no time. "We're going out for brunch. You're coming with me, and don't even think about saying no," Olivia declared over the phone, leaving no room for excuses. At first, Natalie hesitated. The thought of being in a crowded restaurant still made her nervous, but she knew it was time to face another challenge. When she arrived at the venue, her heart raced, but Olivia's lively presence was an unexpected relief. They talked for hours, and although Natalie still felt emotionally heavy, she realized that being with someone she trusted made all the difference. At the end of the meal, Olivia took her hands and said, "I know you're going through something tough, but I want you to know I'm here. You don't have to face this alone." Those words stayed with Natalie. With Olivia's support and her continued sessions with Dr. Harlow, Natalie started to broaden her challenges. Her next goal was to visit the grocery store alone, the same one where, weeks earlier, she had felt paralyzed. This time, she prepared carefully, going over the steps with her therapist. When she parked in the lot, she paused to take a deep breath, repeating the mantra she now carried with her, "I can feel anxiety and still move forward." Inside the store, the world felt less overwhelming than she had anticipated. There were moments of discomfort, but Natalie stayed focused on her tasks. Completing the simple act of grocery shopping was a milestone. She left the store feeling stronger, as if she had reclaimed a piece of her independence. As Natalie continued to move forward, she began to notice something she hadn't before. The anxiety was still present, but her relationship with it was changing. It was no longer an enemy to be defeated at all costs, but a part of her life that she could manage. There were still moments when the old feelings of fear threatened to take over, but now she saw those moments as opportunities for growth. "I'm learning," she thought, instead of criticizing herself. A significant turning point came when Natalie decided to return to an activity she had loved before anxiety took hold: writing. Writing had always been a way for Natalie to process her thoughts, but she had abandoned it during her struggles. With a new notebook in hand, she began documenting her journey, from the early signs of anxiety to her small victories in the present. Writing gave her clarity, allowing her to see the progress that often felt invisible. In the weeks that followed, Natalie started finding joy in simple moments again. A walk in the park, a casual conversation with Olivia, or even the ritual of brewing coffee in the morning. She realized that while anxiety still existed, her life didn't have to be defined by it. These moments served as reminders that change didn't happen all at once but in small, deliberate steps every day. Her relationship with her mother also began to heal. Natalie started opening up more, sharing her fears and victories. Her mother, who had silently worried for so long, was relieved to see her daughter taking control of her life again. "I'm proud of you," her mother said one day as they sipped tea together. Those simple words meant the world to Natalie. Though challenges still lay ahead, Natalie felt something had shifted inside her. She was no longer the person who hid in the dark, avoiding the world. She was someone who, despite the difficulties, was finding strength in her vulnerability. For the first time in a long time, she could see a future filled with possibility. The office smelled of freshly brewed coffee and clean carpets, but for Natalie, each step down the corridor felt like a test of her courage. She clutched a folder filled with her ideas, the product of weeks of hard work. This was the moment she had been preparing for, her first presentation since anxiety had pulled her away from the professional world. Though her heart raced, something inside her held her steady. "I don't need to be perfect," she repeated silently, a phrase she had learned in therapy and now carried with her like a shield. When Natalie decided to return to work, it was an act of faith. After months out of the job market, she feared that no one would want to hire her again. But with Olivia's encouragement and Dr. Harlow's steady guidance, she began taking small steps. First, she updated her resume, then reached out to old colleagues. To her surprise, one of them, Matt Dawson, responded enthusiastically. Now running a small marketing firm, Matt offered Natalie a temporary consulting position with flexible hours and specific projects. The opportunity was both exciting and terrifying. Natalie accepted the offer but knew it would mean confronting situations that still made her uneasy. One of those was presenting her ideas in team meetings, something that had once come naturally but now felt monumental. And that was what brought her to the conference room that day, with Matt and 3 other colleagues waiting to hear her proposals. As she connected her laptop to the projector, Natalie took a deep breath and recalled what she had practiced. She acknowledged the familiar tightness in her chest and the slight tremble in her hands, but instead of fighting these sensations, she accepted them. "Anxiety is here, but so am I," she reminded herself. When she began speaking, her voice was hesitant at first but steadied as she delved into the content she had carefully prepared. The presentation was far from flawless, but Natalie was surprised by her colleagues' support. Matt complimented her ideas and suggested collaborative adjustments for the team to work on together. When it was over, Natalie felt a wave of relief and pride. She had faced one of her biggest monsters, and while challenges remained, that moment marked a significant breakthrough. The following days brought new opportunities for Natalie to prove herself. Over time, she noticed that each small success boosted her confidence. Even on days when her anxiety felt stronger, she now had the tools to handle it. These tools didn't make her invincible, but they gave her something even more valuable: resilience. A particularly pivotal moment came when Matt invited her to a networking event. Natalie knew it would be difficult but recognized how much she could learn and grow from the experience. On the day of the event, she chose an outfit that made her feel confident and rehearsed a few simple phrases to start conversations. When she arrived at the venue, the noise of voices and laughter filled the crowded room. The old impulse to turn around and leave arose, but she ignored it. Natalie began engaging with people, focusing on one conversation at a time. During one of these interactions, she met Rebecca Carter, a businesswoman who shared similar interests and seemed genuinely impressed by Natalie's work. They exchanged contact information and planned to meet again. By the end of the evening, Natalie left the event feeling exhausted but proud. "I did it," she thought, smiling to herself. These experiences began shaping a new perspective for Natalie. She realized that anxiety wouldn't completely disappear, but that didn't mean she was doomed to live under its control. Instead, she started viewing it as part of her story, something that had given her strength and empathy. This acceptance didn't happen overnight, but rather was built gradually, like a patchwork quilt of courageous moments. As her professional life began to take shape again, Natalie also explored new passions. Writing, which had always been a source of comfort, now became a powerful tool for expression. On a personal blog, she began sharing her journey, documenting the highs and lows of living with anxiety and the lessons she was learning. The feedback she received was overwhelming. Strangers left messages saying they felt inspired by her story, which gave Natalie a renewed sense of purpose. The impact was profound. Natalie wasn't just rebuilding her life, she was helping others confront their own battles. Though there was still much to achieve, for the first time, she felt in control of her journey. Natalie sat on a park bench, watching the leaves gently fall in the breeze. The scene, so simple, carried deep meaning for her. There was something special about being there, in the world, fully present. She looked down at the notebook in her hands, filled with notes, reflections, and moments of triumph. Each page told a part of her journey, a story she had once thought impossible to write. In recent months, Natalie had undergone a transformation beyond anything she could have imagined. It wasn't just about returning to work or tackling social challenges. The real progress lay in how she now saw herself. Before, Natalie had viewed her anxiety as a weakness, something that needed fixing. Now, she saw it as a part of who she was, a part that, while challenging, had taught her strength, compassion, and resilience. Her blog, which she had started as a way to process her emotions, had grown beyond her expectations. With each post, Natalie received messages from people across the country who found comfort in her words. Many shared similar stories, thanking her for her honesty and for showing that recovery was possible. Natalie realized that by sharing her story, she was helping others find the courage to face their own struggles. One message in particular stood out. It was from Rebecca Carter, the entrepreneur she had met at the networking event. Rebecca mentioned that she was working on a marketing campaign focused on mental health and asked if Natalie would be interested in leading it. The opportunity not only aligned with her professional expertise but also with her newfound passion for helping others. Natalie accepted the challenge, seeing it as another step in her journey toward growth. As she walked through the park, Natalie reflected on the lessons she had learned along the way. They weren't magical solutions or easy answers, but rather a collection of small moments, like breathing deeply during a panic attack or choosing to face something that once seemed impossible. Every victory, no matter how small, contributed to something greater. Natalie knew there would still be hard days. Anxiety hadn't disappeared entirely, and she accepted that. What had changed was her ability to face those moments, her confidence in knowing she could get through them and keep moving forward. I am not defined by my anxiety, she thought. I am defined by how I choose to face it. Leaving the park, Natalie felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the life she was rebuilding but for the version of herself that had emerged from the difficulties. She had discovered something anxiety could never take away, her inner strength. If this story touched your heart and inspired you in any way, don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us keep sharing stories like Natalie's. Leave a comment below about what impacted you the most, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of resilience. Together, we can spread hope and inspiration. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.